Still waiting for it to go.
Yeah.
Bingo. Thank you very much. And I feel guilty on two fronts. One, that I'm speaking in English. My apologies, but you believe me, it's better this way. And then the other is that I have so much time. I feel that perhaps I should rethink and restrict myself to 3 minutes. It doesn't seem fair, but it's too late. There are too many slides. My title is Reconstruct. I want to thank everybody for staying around, by the way, too. And we'll try to have plenty of time. I'm going to keep this as short as I can with my slide deck so that we'll have time for discussion afterward if you have any questions or comments. As you see, the title is Reconstructing the First Humanities Computing Center, but the key is it's about modeling what we don't know and what I'm learning about modeling in digital humanities by pursuing a new project. So that will emerge in time. So this is the book that Michael mentioned. As I was working on this book in 2015, I made several trips to Milan where the Busa archives are housed. And it was on one such trip in March of 2015 that I took a train to the nearby town of Gallerate, where I was met by my local host, Daniela Carati, who had worked with Father Busa. And she drove me to the Via G. Ferraris, number 2, and we found it sheathed in scaffolding and dust at the time. This is what it looked like later the same year. It was under reconstruction as a charity house, we learned. But I was able to confirm through some of the architectural details, including ones that you would think would be ephemeral, like these arches, these brackets that held up the roof. They're still there. And there were other details like this that confirmed for me that this was, in fact, the site of Father Busa's first Humanities Computing Center that he established there, CAL, the Centro per l'Automazione dell'Analisi Letteraria, sometimes translated as the Center for Literary Data Analysis at the time. It was in operation at that site for about 6 years, from 1961 to 67. And now there's a whole, there's a chapter in my book about this. It's about a history, a kind of technological history and social history of Father Busa's work in that era. But with the help of a grant from the Office of Digital Humanities at the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities, I'm lucky enough to be part of a brilliant team of people who are pursuing a kind of reconstruction, multiple levels and multiple media of that moment in the history of humanities computing, that center, CAL. And this includes Stefan Sinclair, Jeffrey Rockwell, who are doing emulations of Punchcards. You may have seen some examples on the web. It includes Melissa Terrace and Julianne Nyan, who've been doing oral histories and the accounts of the young women who worked as punch card operators in Father Busa's lab, including at this center at CAL. Marco Passarati and others at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, who are helping to digitize materials in the Busa archive. And then at my own institution, Howard Kaplan of the Advanced Visualization Center and his team, who've been helping me conceive of ways that we might model the space provisionally and sometimes roughly and in a series of models rather than trying to reach one endpoint in order to try to learn what we can, including to learn what we can't know about this center. So I see it as a kind of media archaeology project. I won't speak for everyone else on the team. This is just my own hobby horse. And for me, this means that it's about reverse engineering the center as an historical object. So you know about reverse engineering, but I just want to rehearse it. It's a way of taking something apart in order to understand not just what it is, but maybe why it was designed or how it functioned contextually. It's often applied to secret, classified, hidden objects. for obvious reasons. This taking apart, so industrial espionage, yes, in order to reverse engineer and reconstruct something that might compete with another product, but also state espionage in order to understand objects that are being used in warfare, for instance. So it's about trying to discover the design and the purpose of the object, but at the same time, it's taken for granted by most practitioners of reverse engineering that speculation is a part of the process at every stage, and that mostly you will never know everything about the object being reconstructed. This is why it's especially useful in the humanities and social sciences in fields such as archaeology, for instance, the study of cultural heritage. Why capturing and modeling, as we've seen several times today, objects of culture follow the same sort of rules. The point is that you can build what you think you know, but you never know what it is that you're not capturing about these objects. And that very absence, the gap itself, is methodologically significant, if you allow it to be. And sometimes it involves materials other than, I'll just leave this here for a little while. This is the esteemed Jeffrey Rockwell inside the Rift. He's wearing an Oculus Rift. It's a very virtual world at a conference, not the one that we're building. But it makes the point that nowadays reverse engineering takes advantage of materials other than the original, as it always has. So you may use modeling clay or styrofoam to carve objects, for instance. But of course, you also use software for the same purpose at different scales than the original object and different materials than the original object with different affordances than the materials of the original object. So the virtual models should be seen as offering new constraints and new affordances rather than as mere replicas. To paraphrase Gentry Sayers, another esteemed Canadian scholar, in my world, you reverse engineer an object, you reconstruct it in order to make an argument, not to make a replica. Miriam Posner has applied the term suggestively to digital humanities projects themselves, taking them apart in order to see how they were put together and to get at sort of first principles. And this is given her in this terrific video, by the way, for your students, if you don't know it, is given the first sort of primitives of a number of genres of digital humanities projects for building new ones. But also to go back to Gentry Sayers at Victoria and the Maker Lab, they've used this concept to drive their kits for cultural memory out of the maker space there. So these are actual, if you don't know these are actual physical boxes, kits based on the Fluxus kits of the mid-20th century. And they contain components that allow the user to build. So it's reverse engineering in medias res. You collect the box and somebody else has deconstructed the object in imagination, and then you reconstruct it in order to learn about, for instance, a Victorian stick pin with a skull on it that actually existed, but that we don't have much in the way of records of. So as Sayers says, these kits reconstruct the objects by constructing their evidence off the page. And I think that's a deliberate sort of pun. It's literally taken off the page, but also it happens off the page of whatever textual evidence you have for these objects. I also like the fact that these kits make use of both physical, sometimes bluntly physical objects, as well as digital objects. And then that species of object between the digital files that can be 3D printed and scanned and then back again, so that you have both kinds of things, mixed reality. For me, understanding reverse engineering begins with this, this kind of diagram, this so-called exploded view. But you're familiar with these, whether or not you've used them in a professional capacity, you have used them to put together IKEA furniture, for instance, or Lego objects. We all know this sort of instruction in which the components of a device are blown apart, suspended in midair, surrounded by their own metadata, so that you can understand each component clearly, and then understand them in relation to the whole. They're often said to descend from, it's probably like everything else about Leonardo, this is probably not true. They're often said to descend originally from the notebooks of Busa's fellow Milanese, Leonardo. The point is that this is a technique in the history of science that has now become part of the history of science and technology itself. And it's worth thinking about as a metaphor, as well as an actual technique. So with that metaphor in mind of the exploded view of a significant object, I want to return to the Via Ferraris in Gallerate and think about this as the object to be exploded and reverse engineered. That is the center as a whole, not a particular technological object within it necessarily, but the center as a whole. If we did that, we'd have to take seriously the possibility that technology extends beyond, the metal and the wires to include, for instance, the architecture, the space, include chalkboards and flowcharts, sorting tables, but also the people, the human components, including especially these operators who are running the machinery, who often get discounted in stories about Father Busa's work. So the Busa archive contains almost 1,000 photos, mostly professional quality photos commissioned for publicity purposes or for the press. So it's an amazing resource. About 80 of those are of this center Cal in Gallerate. And we're making good use of those in this project, this NEH-funded project. There will be the opportunity for some photogrammetry. We could talk about this later, but mostly we're using these as evidence. We're poring over them in order to learn about this building in which the lab unfolded. When you look at those photos, motifs begin to emerge that can be sorted, I think, into component parts. For instance, the building itself, the architectural space and the infrastructure, the machinery as a separate component that's part of that space that was moved in actually by IBM. The Jesuit culture, that's significant, highly significant component in understanding what Busa was about in designing the space and operating it the way he did. And then those operators, more about them, especially in a minute, but again, this is like this in the 90s, we used to refer to the sneaker net. This is these, just in terms of the operation, humans are required at multiple stages in this process, more self-consciously perhaps than nowadays, although it remains true today. And then the concept and the academic tradition of philology. So to start with the building. That building I visited, and that you saw the photos of earlier, was this square courtyard building. It was really only the entrance to the lab, a fact that only emerged for me on subsequent visits as I began to try to model this interior with this as the exterior. Didn't work, and something was wrong. And then I began to play with Google Earth timeline, and of course the old building suddenly appeared. Was really present there. It wasn't demolished until the early 2000s. So the same building, the vagaries of satellite imagery aside, that's the square building now with the yellow roof, but it's the same building above. And then this long barn-like, shed-like building with multiple peaked roofs is now gone. That's what we think of when we see the interior photographs. That was the primary lab space of Cal in the 60s. With the help of an architect based in Rome, who has based in Rome and Milan, whose name is Laura Romano, we've begun to find old photographs of the building that show traces of that lost long building. You can see to the left here, this is the same square courtyard building before renovation. And you can see to the left the shape of one of the peaks of the peaked building as it extended south from the end of that square building. You don't see it to the right. And there's a reason for that we won't have time to go into architecturally, but we had to piece that together without actual plans or photographs at first. Then she was able to uncover in the Gallerate Civic Archives other photographs, and there the long building appeared. So that's skylight on the roof has been added, was added since Busa's time, but otherwise you see the first of the 4 peaks of the long peaked roof building. This is the team that met with me in November at the site to discuss that building and to try to resituate, to figure out how it was situated on that site. And that's the architect, Laura Romano, on the left. You see me in the center and other members of the team. But I want to call your attention to another figure on the right there, the woman all the way to the right of the group. This is the formidable Livia Canestraro, who figures heavily in the story of what Busa did in that lab, how the work was structured, and in fact, who was a kind of co-author and significant contributor to that story in ways that are only beginning to emerge. I was delighted to finally meet her. I knew something about her from reading transcripts of the oral histories that Terrace and Nyan were constructing. So it was a pleasure to meet her that day. It was even greater pleasure when she, and here she is, by the way, in 1961. It's the same, that's Livia Canestraro with Father Busa unpacking the trays of punch cards in this new space as they're moving in. She's always been formidable. She reached into her bag on site and produced a floor plan that she had drawn that morning at breakfast on graph paper, of course, from her memorial reconstruction of the layout of the lab and of where the rooms were situated. We didn't even ask for this. We just told her we were having the meeting in order to talk about these things, and she came prepared. It's an invaluable resource now for building these models. So what we see is that these operators lined in this kind of, obviously scientific industrial kind of way. We'll say more about that in a minute, but also off to the side at the sorting tables, where they've got boxes of punch cards between them doing important sort of manual work in the stages of that process. And in our models, we're trying to sort of account for details that don't seem to matter for the workflow, but that do. So these are some early sketches that then were turned into things that we could view together on the web in Unity of some of these features. Those skylights, for instance, which were clearly put in when this was a textile factory in order to distribute the light to the workers down on the floor. This is an image of the move-out day at the end of the operation in 1967, and IBM employees have shown up to take the machinery out. I won't zoom on this now, but if you did, you'd see to the left and far back 7 rows of the operators still working or pretending to work for the photographers, and I don't know which, still sitting there as the machinery is being dismantled. And we'll say more about those drawings on the wall, like those decorations. They look like mid-century lozenges that we've seen, sort of Mad Men era decorations of various kinds, but I think they're significant. And then the operators sat at the metal machinery on rugs on top of the cement floors. These were mostly Model 24 and 26 key punch machines, but there were other machines at the end of the row that we've learned about since. Or they sat at the sides, as we've said, and did the sorting work. And then again, those cabinets along the wall held the punch cards. There are plug boards on the case at the far end of the wall. All of this we had to learn about by poring over the documentation and the photographs. Father Busa had an office down at the end of one of the cells. So this is in the same space, but next door to where the operators were working. You can see that there are some color photos in the archive, and there's furniture here set up for conference space. And we'll say more about that stained glass window, that giant head of Christ, modernist head of Christ, that was boxed in. This is not an exterior window. It was boxed into the space with electric light behind it, and served as an office, but also clearly as a kind of dais, sometimes almost an altar for ceremonies. If you look at this image though to the right, you can't see it in this resolution very well, but there are bits of scripture in Greek or Hebrew. They look like they're chalked, but they're actually painted on the walls. This one is from Romans. It seems to me that it's hard to avoid seeing these as a kind of Jesuit version of those signs that were everywhere at IBM headquarters. Father Busa spent a good deal of time both in New York and in Milan at IBM headquarters, where inspirational signs, this is only the most famous, were everywhere. But again, you put the two cultures together, it becomes much more interesting. But the point is that this was a textile factory, and of course the metaphors are almost too inviting, aren't they? From textiles to texts, from this sort of weaving, of fabric to the skein of words. In fact, if you know anything about textile machinery, there were probably punch cards involved originally. The jacquard looms that may have predated the modern looms in this space that formed patterns in the cloth, and then there were punch cards involved here. It's also crucially important for the economics of the center, because it was this textile family that donated the use of the space. It was another industrial family, the mechanics firm, that gave a cash donation that allowed the center to operate for the first year, and in whose offices Busa started Cal before he was ready to move it into this former textile factory. So about the machinery, which is where most of these accounts of Busa start and often end. So this is IBM Italia in Milan. Again, the local captains of industry, the Italian state provided some resources to Busa. The Jesuit order provided him time, and in that sense, and some travel resources in order for him to do the work. But mostly IBM was the patron of this project over the course of decades. Mostly directly through IBM Italia, as it became called, their headquarters in Milan. And this was after Father Busa famously, this is the account that everyone hears over and over again, famously went to New York and made an agreement with Thomas J. Watson Sr., the founder of the company. In his office, he said, to pursue this research project. He said that Thomas J. Watson, another founding father, the father of the church and so on, these two fathers in this meeting, made this agreement with the understanding, he said, Busa said, that he didn't change the name of the company to International Busa Machines. Everyone laughs. It's a good story. It's all that we really had for decades ago. So as I begin to research this account, all sorts of other details emerged. So after this agreement, then Father Busa began these projects that lasted for decades with IBM support. Well into the 90s, it was still sort of getting funding from IBM, and actually there's some question into the 21st century funding coming. And of course, he had this, we forget how important this was, an endless supply of paper punch cards, which were often just called IBM cards at the time, in recognition of IBM's dominance of the worldwide market for them. There's a great deal more we could say about punch cards, but we'll leave that for now. When you look at the machinery came rent-free, basically. This was how it was operated. It was borrowed rent-free for an indefinite period. Huge sort of resource for Father Busa. When you look at these machines in the photographs, you can learn a good deal, including sometimes, the source text that they were using to input the cards. You can actually see sometimes what they were looking at. And sometimes, you can see the pattern in the punch cards as they make their way through the machines. There's an animation of the machine in operation that we're going to include in the model. These machines were used in a series, never one at a time, and they were different machines dedicated to different functions. The punch, the reproducing punch, the sorting machine, the various kinds, the printing card punch, which printed natural language or numbers on the cards as well as punching the holes, and then the collator. And then the collection of the machines would form the sort of infrastructure. Now, I'm using these period manuals for a reason, of course. They demonstrate a number of things, including the gendered nature of the labor, the kinds of operators that would be expected to use these machines at the time. This was highly skilled data processing work, and sometimes it involved even a little plug board hardware programming so that a panel could be rearranged and then inserted into the machine to reprogram that machine. Or a program card could be wrapped around the drum for instructions for the machine and inserted into the machine. This was not unskilled work. It was treated, however, mostly in the same way that traditional clerical work had always been treated, that is, as women's work. Here's a little clue that's worth remembering. We think of these as archaic already by the 1960s. Everyone's aware of the proto-mainframe computers, the ENIAC and the UNIVAC, the Colossus during the war. History of computing emphasizes those machines precisely because they look like ancestors of our current computers, when in fact, this sort of machinery remained normal practice for decades and overlapped with the birth of those large-scale calculators and stored program computers proper. Father Boos's work was the sort of thing that IBM continued to exploit as a market for this sort of machinery well into the 70s, actually, with different models of these machines. This office work, this data processing, this accounting work, then began. They saw as a kind of steady, normal science underneath the sort of more visible projects with large-scale machines to calculate trajectories of rockets, for instance, or to do sort of public PR work. It was 1962 before IBM's revenues from true stored program computers exceeded their revenues from this sort of punch card machinery. Remember, Father Boos's lab was founded just around that time. And this is the sort of machine that was coming online at the time, the IBM 705 electronic data processing machine, a recognizable proto-mainframe setup. Takes up a whole room, and each component is connected in the ways that we became familiar with in later mainframes. Father Boos was aware of this, and he did in fact use it as soon as he was able. Here he is at the console of the IBM 705 in New York. And by the way, there's I've only just last month discovered there's a photograph in the archive that doesn't usually get seen. It was in a different folder and it came in late, where Father Boos is sitting next to Paul Tasman, his great collaborator at IBM, who's actually running the machine for him. This was a photo opportunity. And so then they clearly moved Tasman out of the way and then took the photo that got used for the press of Busa at the console. An important reminder. This was a tape drive machine, as you see, and the magnetic tape allowed Busa to process the data serially and much more quickly, rather than in the stages that we've seen with the punch card machine. Now to Jesuit culture. That stained glass window, again, is the most vivid reminder, and we've modeled it in the 3D models that we're building, crucial, as a symbolic object, reminding us of the significance of the Jesuit order and its history in Father Boos's conception of the center and in its reception at the time. Especially, when you see the photos in the archive of visiting clergy and ceremonies, it's brought home. Here they're blessing the machines at an inauguration. Sometimes, with the covers removed, as if they're peering into the soul of the punch card machine. That's fascinating. With the relays sort of exposed to it. Well, this is a reminder that the center was not self-contained. In fact, the headquarters for Boos's operations, in a hierarchical sense, were up the road, up the hill, at his home college in Gallarate, the Alwasianum. And that division, the hierarchy that it implies, in fact, this was a gendered hierarchy as well, apparently most of the people who did this work. This was the conceptual work, the designation of the markup systems and so on took place up the hill, and then the execution took place in the factory, in that sort of light industrial part of Gallarate. The Jesuit order famously has a worldwide mission, historically for good and ill. That means that the order sees itself as being ready to be called anywhere in the world at any time. And this has come with, among other things involving those missions, the construction of schools that are often connected to scriptoria, and even to printing presses historically. And that's an important part of Father Boos's media history. For Busa, this was connected to the emerging global identity of IBM at the time in interesting ways. In 1949, the year that Father Busa first visited IBM in New York, just before he arrived, IBM had established its own World Trade Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary company with its headquarters downtown in New York, not on Madison Avenue, but down by the then new UN building, whose purpose was, as a plaque said on the wall, world peace through world trade. It's the beginnings of the multinational corporation that we know in this post-war period. It was there that Father Busa was sent, despite the story about the building in Madison Avenue and the meeting with the founder. It was to the World Trade Corporation that he was immediately sent. And actually, Paul Tasman, who was the head engineer for the World Trade Corporation, said later that he believed he was supposed to make the Jesuit go away. But that, in fact, he was impressed, and I think he's probably responsible for the project actually being supported at IBM. Well, to dig a little deeper into the Jesuit culture and media archaeology, Siegfried Zielinski has argued that Athanasius Kircher here, the Renaissance polymath and classical philologist, built on the Jesuit network, the worldwide network, to pursue his science, and also in the Jesuit tradition of science, of tinkering with devices and constructing what they needed in order to do the work they were doing for these missions. And in fact, Kircher is famously the inventor of this combinatoric calculating machine, which used these wooden inserts that can be seen as ancestors of punch cards of various kinds as well. The resemblance between Kircher and Busa across the centuries is no accident. If anything, it's overdetermined, and this Jesuit culture is an important part of it. Here's publicity by IBM. This is in a window at IBM headquarters in New York, making a connection, celebrating Father Busa's work and their support for it. And here we have the visual cliche that persists to this day in commercials and so on, of the connection between the medieval scriptorium and the electronic data processing room on the right there. And then off to the side, you can see there's discussion of the Index Thomisticus, Father Busa's massive project. And the image of his punch cards, you can just see the edge up. So the connection was part of IBM's self-representations as well. So these were the students in Busa's own annotations of the photographs. They're often referred to as pupils or students, sometimes as computers, the job description, and sometimes very rarely by name. This is one scholarship class. They got 2-year scholarships. They're mostly young women, straight out of school, who were given 2-year scholarships, were trained on the use of these machines, worked on the Index Thomisticus and other projects, and then were given help with job placement in this burgeoning industry of data processing in post-war Italy at the time. So for Father Busa, I think it's pretty clear that this center was also modeled on Jesuit schools, not just on the IBM training programs that I'm sure he was also exposed to at IBM. And we know, for instance, that these young women had to take theology and English classes in addition to doing their work on the Index Thomisticus and other punch card projects as part of their scholarship. So those operators now, to zoom in a little more on those. Here's another class of the operators and the pupils, the scholarship students, now in their white lab coats. And there's sort of support staff and other people here, especially the male members of the group. Now we think of these maybe as scientific, aspirationally scientific uniforms, but remember that they're worn by people in various industries to this day, but certainly at the time across Italy. Still, I think it's a symbolic a kind of representation of the kind of work they were going to be doing, but at the same time, it carries various kinds of Catholic connotations in this room under that window as well. So here they are again in those white coats. There were at the founding of the school and the center, there were 17 operators. It later grew slightly larger, but that was roughly the number. And of those, they worked 4-hour shifts to a day, a regular sort of work day, in the industrial model there, for an 8-hour day, punching data onto the cards, not only for the Index Thomisticus, but for related projects, as we'll see. By the time they were finished, they had a certain amount of training they could use in the job market. Some of them were made supervisors, especially the formidable Livia Canestraro, who was the supervisor of the supervisors in the end, and said, interestingly enough, in the oral history that Terrace and Nyan have recorded, that she was once Father Busa tried to replace her with a young man, and there was a kind of rebellion in the ranks against this. And it was not only, she says, not only the young women, but the other men at the center didn't like this idea and persuaded him not to do it. And she kept her job. She worked for Father Busa for about a decade, from 1953 to 63. She said in the end, she got benefits from her time at the center, including the ability to travel. She was later able to even come to the United States, which were unusual for Italian women of her age at the time. And she's grateful for that. But in the end, she said she was interested in the notion that women should be able to do the same tasks as men. And she leaves that hanging with the suggestion that perhaps, the center was not organized in quite the same way, and that this was a limitation that she had to overcome. The pictures tell the story. Of course, the young women are head down and hands on the keys, while the men in suits mill around and watch the demonstration or participate in the ceremony. And they're countless. There's, the 80 pictures, there's a huge number of them that show scenes like this. Onto philology. So this is a loaded term, historically, comes with all sorts of interesting baggage, and it's a complicated topic. But Father Busa used it repeatedly to describe what he was doing at the center. And I just want to suggest that, these images on the wall here may be invocations of the philological tradition. That's just my opinion. I have no idea. I've learned that they were painted by the daughter of one of the industrialists who donated resources to the center. I've only learned that this semester, but I don't know whether she designed them as well or whether she painted them to commission. So for now, we'll just have to speculate. And you see they contain in their odd shapes some recognizable letters. Sometimes they're actual letters. Other times they just look like glyphs or squiggles on other walls. They're not recognizable as from real languages. So I think they may be representations of the kind of fragmentary nature of all historical study of the language, the way the language comes down to us through history. They may represent, a kind of ideal for this sort of work, which is language blown to bits, so that it can then be processed as data. That's a possibility because we have here just the individual signs. Sometimes there are a couple of letters included, the components of the larger linguistic pursuit. But I also think they probably invoked the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were newly discovered at the time and on which Father Busa's lab also worked. It was less known than the Index Thomisticus project. Tried to apply the same techniques to the production of lemmatized concordances, in St. Thomas. They tried to apply those same techniques to the study of the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mostly this failed. That is, it didn't result in a printed index the way the Index Thomisticus did, a multi-volume print index that's still available online and in libraries as a print reference work existed, but not for the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's a complicated story that we won't go into, but I think it's clear that in retrospect, that this process of working on the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed itself to be self-deconstructing, that it became a kind of matter of iterative processing that raised more questions than it answered. And it was also part of Busa's aspirations to form an international scholarly coalition, and there are documents to support this. This is a photograph in the Busa archive of some of the fragments. Of course, it involved, this is what the materials on the Dead Sea Scrolls look like in the Busa archive currently, mostly unaccessioned in a big filing cabinet. They involve the use of facsimiles. Here he is on the console of the computer comparing printout to the facsimile image of one of the scrolls. And they involved the use of transcriptions when they could get them. These were not, these were still rare, difficult to find. And when they did get them, they split them open and marked them up. So you can see their embedded system of markup on the right around the Hebrew text. And actually there are documents that explain what the asterisk and all the other marks meant to them as they were converting these transcripts to punch card data. And they involved custom punch cards produced by IBM for this project so that the Hebrew could be printed on them. And the cards run in reverse direction so that the machine could read the Hebrew appropriately. In fact, the machines had to be altered sometimes so that the platens could run in reverse. You also see, by the way, off to the right, the bubbles for mark sensing pencils. This was one of the first occasions of IBM using that technology for optical reading of the cards. And then that data was often, in the end, transferred to magnetic tape. This is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls tapes in the archive for serial processing and for portability. IBM exploited this as well, of course, in their advertising and publicity about their work with Father Busa. Here it's in a kind of magazine ad under the rubric of solving literary puzzles, which is another reason I think those pieces made on the wall may represent this kind of puzzle solving. There's Father Busa presenting at IBM headquarters on the Dead Sea Scrolls in front of the 705. That's the very console that this IBM operator is sitting at, that he was photographed sitting at earlier. It's a press guy. And here he is in the desert, possibly at Qumran. They attended a conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship in Jerusalem, and he seems to have taken a field trip. And I'm guessing it's not labeled. I'm guessing that this may be to the site of the discovery of the most famous of the scrolls. This work bled over in Father Busa's mind with work in machine translation at the time, which was burgeoning right up until a report in the 60s, a notorious report by committee argued that not enough progress was being made, and then funding was cut radically, the ALPAC report of 1966, and then the money dried up. But for a while, it was a booming field in computing, and Father Busa was right there. This is a demonstration IBM organized just before the founding of CAL in 1954 to translate Russian texts on the fly for the press. And it was arranged, the press release from IBM says that a girl, the press release says, would input the texts without knowing Russian. This is an old myth, by the way, but so that it would increase the accuracy because she was doing it by rote. And then those texts would be translated by the machine at the breakneck speed, it really was fast, of 2.5 lines per second on the printer, using an IBM 701 defense calculator. And of course, this kind of work at the time was inevitably defense work. And sure enough, this was funded by the Defense Department of the US, among other agencies. Father Busa organized a connection between the group that performed this demonstration out of Georgetown University, linguists there, scientists who worked with IBM to do the demonstration, and the European Atomic Energy Community in Ispra, Italy, just up the road from Gallerate and his center. In fact, he says that he made the connection and was the connection himself between the Georgetown IBM group and the Atomic Energy Center, so that machine translation experiments could be undertaken there. And as a result, funds came directly to his center in Gallerate. So it's not just in a metaphorical sense that this was a Cold War effort or that defense funds helped support this sort of work. It was literally the case that Pentagon funding found its way to the center as a result of this work. Here he is at Euratom at Ispra. Here he is outside in a popular picture with the scaffolding behind him, which he visited for the first time in 1961, the same year that he founded his center. And he drew up agreements between all the parties himself. He called himself the connection, and I think that's a significant term. Also in 1961, he attended a conference in France and presented a paper that's available in which he argued for the things he hoped to do worldwide as a result of funding he received from Euratom. And this included forming other centers around the globe, connecting them with a newsletter, sharing standards for markup and for procedures. Does this start to sound familiar? And, and then in the end, sort of sharing data in the form of punch cards and magnetic tape among the centers. Most of this wasn't realized, although he did help to found 3 or 4 other centers around the world as a part of this ambition. And of course, it's very much like today's aspirations. An organization like ADHO could take its orders directly from this paper. Here he is presenting on the numbers of words processed in multiple languages at the center. It's important to remember it was not only the Index Themysticus, but these other projects, including the Russian text for machine translation, that were pursued at the time. And there are printed results, Index Themysticus volumes, on display. In 1958, Father Busa presented his work at the IBM Pavilion at the World's Fair in Brussels. It was the first such expo held since the end of the war. So it was highly significant and clearly had a kind of Cold War theme. The theme was a new humanism, by which it was clearly meant that, that atomic energy and computing were not necessarily as threatening as they appeared to everyone at that moment in history, and that they had a humanistic side. And Busa's presence on the stage at the IBM Pavilion, I believe, was part of this effort on IBM's part to extend computing in these directions. Here he is inside the pavilion making his presentation, a large crowd. In fact, right next door, the IBM RAMAC machine, the RAM stands for what you think it does. It was the first disk system with random access memory with a stack of disks you can see behind them that answered questions in world history in multiple languages for the crowd as a kind of performance piece. And here's Busa visiting the IBMer in charge of that site. And also next door, the Eames Studios, Charles and Ray Eames, of the famous chairs, were commissioned by IBM to produce an animated film on creativity and computing. Reads a lot like an early Apple ad in its argument that engineers and artists shared a kind of creative impulse and that computing could help creativity blossom. Brilliant little film, actually. So Father Busa said he managed these connections on an exchange basis. And you can think of this as sort of an exchange for his students. They got this work for Euratom, and of course, if they, after practicing inputting Russian text, many of them were hired at Euratom up the road when they graduated from Cal. But also there was currency exchanged. And then I think it's also this kind of exchange. He was a sort of switching station for all of these strands in his view of this far-flung network. Or maybe it's this kind of exchange, which you can see above his head there. The plug boards that I mentioned earlier. Remember, this was a time when for telephone exchanges, this sort of manual plug board, operated mostly by women as well, would make connections. Anyway, these were ways of programming the machine so that this panel has a handle so you can carry it from one machine to another, or you can take it from the machine and store it and then reuse it. I think, in a way, this is a useful metaphor for Busa's ideal for himself and the network that he was building. So this is a famous photo that is on the cover, where he's showing that he can read the punch cards, with the naked eye in the light. But of course, he's holding the punch card as if it were a kind of sacred object as well, given that lighting in the sort of the Renaissance portrait background. This is a fascinating kind of image. And I think it's Father Busa's role here should be seen as he was very much, despite being very much Jesuit, he was very worldly. He saw his mission as building these networks and these connections across the boundaries of his own order, of the scientific industrial management world that he was trying to emulate and learn from, and of the scholarly world, where the study of language and culture was informed by these other strands. So when we're building these sketch models currently, we're attempting to get the dimensions right, and we occasionally have ghostly presences. We're going to see what we do about these uncanny operators. So that this building with its 4 peaked roofs is the center of our obsession currently, to make sure we get this right. Because it was the design that shaped the workflow, that shaped the process, and that was shaped by the process of indexing and concordance building and natural language processing. At the time, you could see the large head of Christ to the right in the chamber that Father Busa occupied. This is just a very early sketch that was moved into Unity from Maya. But we're also modeling individual objects so that in the end, each of them will be accessible in a collection that can be examined up closely. This is the iconic IBM Model 24 punch card machine, the sort of linchpin, the sort of key component in the infrastructure of Kahn. So that long building where all of this took place, and it's important in the history of computers and the humanities, the history of technology in general in some ways. It's crucial to understanding the legacy of this kind of practice as it's represented in digital humanities now, to raising questions about the role of this legacy. That we all know now that digital humanities has more than one sort of lineage, and that we're all about now constructing multiple stories about the origins of these sorts of practices. But this one has been hugely influential, and it's worth pursuing, I think. That's why I wrote the book. It's an attempt to complicate the myth with more history. That long building isn't there anymore, as we said. So with other projects that we've discussed today, we've had to reconstruct it from what we have, including things like this photograph that Livia kind of Estrada brought to our meeting, that it doesn't exist in the Busa archive, and it represents an alternative image of the work going on in the center at the time, on top of her floor plan. You know, we have to use every resource available. I've learned that this is normal practice in 3D modeling, to use opportunistically whatever you can get your hands on in the way of online and archival materials. And at every stage, speculation remains central to the process, and it's not something to be eradicated. In fact, materializing, you know, concretizing our ignorance is an extremely valuable stage in the process of modeling. And sometimes that's where it stops. And that's important too. So this is a center about which we know very little still. It's a crucial site, you know, in that metaphorical as well as literal sense in the history of computers and the humanities. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments?
One comment and one question.
Okay.
In terms of the sort of unknown or reconstruction, I've been calling all of those solutions that we come up as hypothetical extrapolations, which is as vague as possible. But I was wondering if you could perhaps speak more about the concept of the copy and translatio, which seems to be at the root of this project, and how you see that playing out both methodologically and theoretically.
Yeah, I would resist that rhetorical application for what we're doing first, which is why I go instead to the media archaeology model. So I think what we're doing instead is taking apart what we've been given, even if that's conceptual rather than obviously material at first, in order to piece it back together and to see if the reconstruction makes a different kind of sense. So I'm deliberately going there metaphorically instead of to this, but you know, I think this is a persuasive argument you're making. It's not our argument, however. So I think that in fact, Busa may have seen it this way, but we're resisting merely following that kind of theological or philosophical model for what's going on here. I love the fact that in your project, you know, of course, this is right. I mean, the representation of what's been altered, the representation of what's been found, and then the questionable objects that are neither this nor that, or maybe both. There are lots of ways of trying to do that, and I love your solutions for doing that. In this case, what we have are this sort of self-curated photographic archive, and even, you know, you have to remember that it's like a corporate archive, only more so in some ways. He collected these, he commissioned the photos, he collected the photos, he curated the collection, and then he handed it on at his death in 2011. The only reason we have access to them now. So those photos are, you know, I've tried to illustrate a couple of ways that they were staged. Well, obviously, they're sort of tableau vivant, and you know they called the photographer in, and a number of these operators have said to us, "Well, we didn't do it exactly that way. That's the way they wanted to do the photograph." You know, so I don't think there is any. There's no, you know, it's all translations all the way down. You know what I mean? I don't think there's any place to stand here except on, you know, we find ourselves in Busa's archive if we try to find anything And that's sort of the point. We start with only interior shots. There are no exterior images in the archive of that building. And then try to work our way from inside out to what the thing looked like. And we know we were getting a lot of it wrong. But, you know, for instance, the interior shots show that two of those cells come into the space further than the others. And that's precisely where the shadow of the peaks doesn't show up on the existing square building. So with Romano, we're trying to imagine architecturally why that was and what happened. So that, you know, there's part of the building that's gone, you know, the square building even, that might explain those missing peaks. But you know, that's the beginning of thinking about sort of what was going on in the space. I didn't show an image of the flow chart that we found that came to the Busa archive while I was working there in 2015. It sounds like something out of a novel, but a Jesuit showed up on with a brown paper package of materials that he had collected and gave them to the library. And they brought them to the room I was working in. And so it was our first time I unwrapped it and sort of began to look at things. And one of the things was a fold-out flowchart dated 1952, very early in the process of working with IBM, right before their big demonstration that Tasman and Busa held at IBM headquarters. And it uses the traditional iconography for flowcharts at the time, some of which are still in use, but included images of slide decks, you know, abstract images of the cards, of card decks stacked, and of boxes of different shapes representing different operations in the stage of the workflow. Well, this was the idealized workflow for a demonstration in 1952. Whether that was still what they were doing in 1961 outside Milan, we'll never quite know. We also have sort of, I try to triangulate, we have sort of accounts by, there's a Dutch linguist who visited Busa writing a book about current practices in data processing, literary data processing. And he left a draft of that chapter in 2 languages in the Busa archive, because he had sent them to Busa for approval. And Busa marked them up and commented. So the book was later published, and we have the published book, but then we also have this draft in which this guy sort of as a kind of surrogate for us. It asks those questions of Father Busa. But this is a very controlled environment again, in which Father Busa is being given questions and is answering the questions about what went on in the center. It's much more interesting when you triangulate these, for instance, with the accounts by these operators. And you begin to learn all sorts of things. There was a secretarial space in the center of the lab. It doesn't show up in any of his explanations. That was a kind of control center or clerical control center, you know. But we never would have learned of this without kind of Strauss drawing and her explanation. So all of that's to say, there's no, I don't think there's any, I mean, I don't want to go too quickly to Foucault, but media archaeology has been informed by Foucault for a reason, and I think there's a sense in which what we're modeling here are always gaps and discontinuities, and we can construct arguments about there being continuities, but they're always just that argument. Is that?
Yeah, I was just thinking of copy and translation in terms of what the work they were actually doing there. And then how the reconstruction of the space is actually the intention of that work. It's interesting that was just something.
No, it's very interesting. And actually, you know, Father Busa, for those of you who don't know, his dissertation work on St. Thomas Aquinas was on the words for presence in the text of St. Thomas. So he's theologically and philosophically very much interested in, you know, the logos in the text, and at the same time is accused of sort of that kind of atomization of the text that allowed for automation. And he's in a kind of you know, homiletic way. He tells stories all the time in his writings. One of them is about the bulldozer of computing progress that is storming over the garden of the humanities, right, crushing all the flowers of creativity. And he says this is a kind of myth. And then in fact, what happened was that the operator of the bulldozer decided he needed help with understanding language, and then the humanist was called out. And you know, so it's a very, very strange, kind of fascinating kind of stories that he tells about this. But if anything, I think what we see is there's a kind of tension I tried to demonstrate here in the sort of colliding worlds of Father Busa's own alliances. On the one hand, the scientific industrial model for this sort of labor that he gets from IBM and they get from other sources, he doesn't only get from IBM. It overlaps in significant ways with the way Jesuit schools and production centers were already being run for centuries. That's significant. It's not just that they're in, but there's still tension there. And some of this tension shows up in his annual reports to his superiors in the order. And he has to account for his progress. And it's the thing we've all had to, you've got to keep the funds coming, keep the administration on your side in order to keep doing the work. And it's fascinating that way. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I'll jump on what you just said. And I'd like to offer a play of words, if I may. Your title was Reconstructing for Humanities Computing Center, and it sounds to me more like the first humanist computing center. So I'm wondering to what extent that building and the work organization was different because it was led by Jesuit values. Was there any sort of Jesuit ethics that was overseeing the work of one that was there? So that's my first question.
Okay.
My second one is I'm struck by the difference between this context and the French context.
Yes.
At the exact same time.
Yes.
In the French context, the Jesuits in the 50s and 60s were trying out these experiments of sending Jesuits to factories and to work with the people, and that sort of didn't play out well for them. And soon enough, they were sort of sent back to education. I'm wondering, do they not see the labor that's involved in information processing as labor? And do they see this coming out of the book culture and not the factory culture? So I'm a bit surprised by the enthusiasm of the Italian.
Yeah. Well, I think this is, I was too. I think you're right that ultimately, this is speculative as well, of course, but I mean, we can reconstruct some of this from the correspondence and from, as I say, Father Bussa's annual reports to his superiors where he explains the mission of the center and so on. But I think it's clear that there was a difference between the way the order viewed what he was doing and the way he viewed what he was doing, and that the enthusiasm for the scientific industrial model was mostly on his part. The anchor project was the Index to Mysticus, and for many people, that's all they know about what Father Bussa did. I don't think that's accidental. I mean, I think there was and again, we're not unfamiliar with this technique, are we? The large anchor project to, sort of found a center with, and then to sort of draw the funding and attention. But I think in his case, the fact that it was this work, 11 million words of the collected works of St. Thomas, which took decades, to produce this lemmatized concordance and to print it. The goal was always to print it. Is in this case, of course, although later then, retroactively, the digital versions were produced for that was vital for his continued support inside the Jesuit order. And then these other projects he did, there was a small project of digitizing, we would now say, processing the language in Goethe, for instance. And there was a German conference where he worked with scholars and did that. And he his initial foray into these methods, which he published in a 1952 paper, by the way, was one of the first of these humanistic papers to contain data tables at the back, right, where he showed sort of the results of these experiments at IBM. He started with Dante, with hymns, because they were shorter, manageable sort of works. And then once he established the method of work, then he moved on to St. Thomas. So yeah, I think your question about sort of the tensions there is, I would just like to leave an open question. I think there clearly these tensions are at work. I don't know much about that French context. I know Father Bussa was aware, for instance, of the French opportunities when it came to the computing machinery. We forget maybe that IBM's monopoly was not fully established yet when he first began this work, and it's on its way to being. But then the other answer, I think it's an answer to one of your questions, stop me is that this is all about the post-war period. So especially in Italy, in the theater there, but in other European countries as well, this is part of IBM seeing itself as contributing to the U.S. mission, when it comes to the Marshall Plan and so on. And we have a number of anecdotes about this, and opening up these markets for their own, expansion at the same time. Of course, it's now known that IBM continued, through plausibly deniable subsidiaries to sell punch cards and operate machinery during the Nazi regime through the German company Wehrmacht. And they had a kind of public relations issue already when it came to this sort of thing. So part of what's going on here is the kind of usual corporate philanthropy as one side of what they do in order to, counterbalance their image in other ways. So IBM had interests as well. It's even more complicated than Busa and the Jesuits and how they viewed these things. And I think that the Jesuit interest in this model, in Busa's case, reads pretty much like an educational mission, which is why he keeps calling it a school, not just a it's not a factory. It's a center, but it's a center for this literary data processing that at other times he refers to as a school, and then he has them take classes, in addition to sort of justify their scholarships on educational grounds. That's fascinating. I forgot to bring the stack of punch cards that I usually hand out at this moment. You can pretend I did.
I know questions coming. We've had like a productive afternoon, but yes.
So I'm also fascinated by the, I don't think, you probably have read this in the book, but if you summarize the Jesuit influence of a tinkering culture, which is fascinating, and a global perspective, a pedagogical perspective that's maybe not quite as strong.
Well, and even a voracious global appetite. I mean, that's part of it. It was that there was this kind of worldwide mission.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
And of course the sort of theological philology traditions that have existed for a long time, not in a digital context, but and we were talking a bit before about I'm interested in sort of early French work in that retroactively could be studied in this area in the context of like that and some of the surprising things maybe. But I wonder if you have any conjectures about this is sort of beside what the core of what you were saying, but in terms of early work in Italy there or Pisa or elsewhere where there's something that you could point at that is important. So like in France, possibly the Russian formalism and the communication that was happening there, the sort of nationalistic desire to establish a French language materials for diplomacy and that sort of thing. Those are all sort of factors that we don't necessarily encounter first in the popular translation. In the Italian context,
my sense of it when it comes to Busa is that he was leveraging his, if you'll pardon the term, his connections in the United States, in Italy, and vice versa. So that, I mean, this was part of his networking expertise, right? So that he traveled, remember that you couldn't take those ocean liners during the war safely. This was this was afforded by the very basic fact that he could travel back and forth to New York starting in 1948 as a result of the availability of transportation. But he was going back and forth, and he was carrying, in a kind of diplomatic way, he was carrying attitudes and knowledge about these things back, and then representing himself as a representative of these forces to his local college, to the Jesuits, and I think to the Italian press frequently in the materials that I've seen. So this was the moment of data processing. When you look at it, it's everywhere. This was the normal data science of the day, not the outlier sort of large computing projects that we all know about, but this kind of constant churning of these punch cards everywhere all over the world. What's going on? In New York, they used they called them chips at IBM. We call them Chads now in America, mostly because of a bad election we had once. But we won't go into that. But those punch out, those were collected, and then they used to throw them out the window during ticker tape parades. You want a symbol. So the fact is that his expertise, his connection to IBM was something that was valued where he was, and then his sort of connections, even frankly to the Vatican. You know, he arranged for audiences for executives from IBM and stuff. So there was a cultural exchange role. This when he says he performed on an exchange basis, I think he meant this in this broad sort of cultural way. He was the kind of connection. So I don't know if that's what you were at, but I think my sense is that Italy this was all about the Reconstruction, about the sort of the Marshall Plan, and about the rebuilding the economy, and this giant headquarters of IBM just outside Milan. It was a manufacturing plant. Can't be overlooked. That's the elephant in the story in a way, right in the room. I don't think it would have happened in quite the same way without his proximity to IBM Milan, which became IBM Italia during the course of his working with them. So IBM targeted Italy for certain reasons, and I think as a result, Busa was able to exploit that adjacent possibility for his own work, and then they in turn exploited him as part of their publicity, their outreach, and their philanthropy. So, yeah. Good. Okay.
No, well, please join me in thanking
Thank you
Steve
very
for,
much.